think we're right at 20 after, so we can get started. And I think we're all done with our essential ed kind of announcements, so we're good on that side. But I will go ahead and get started. My name is Mike Johnson. If I haven't met you before, I'm the National Director for the TABE test within DRC, and certainly happy to be here today. I'm supposed to try to stay in front of the camera and use the microphone, so two things I'm not good at. And I have to repeat questions, so I'll make sure I remember to do that too. So we'll talk about TABE today, but before we get started, anybody come here with a super burning question that you wanted to make sure you got answered, that you didn't want to leave before that you needed to make sure we cover today? Or any very detailed questions? So nothing, everybody just wants to know the general information? All right. So we can cover that and we're going to go forward from where we're at. Make sure the slides are moving here today. Of course they're not. So we will jump to, there we go. So I'm not going to go too deep into the kind of background of TABE, but everybody's fairly familiar with TABE being a comprehensive assessment. But what we're going to talk about today is both TABE and TABE Class-E. So how many people are using TABE Class-E for an ESL process? So, okay, so about half or so. And then everybody else using TABE for adult ed purposes and different uses around that. So we'll cover both of them and go into some of the updates, what's changing on both of them and some of the details related to that. And then also go into some of the research pieces that we have available and some of the research pieces that are happening to kind of tie everything together, talk a little bit about our workforce portal, and then certainly answer any questions as we go forward. And I keep messing up that I touch things and the slides stop working on there. There we go. So just real quick, both TABE 13 and 14 and TABE Class-E, C, and D are federally approved today. And both are available in the online formats. So paper and pencil formats that I know a lot of people have been asking questions for. So just real quick on paper and pencil, the order forms for both Class-E and TABE 13 and 14 will be posted later this month. So middle of April or so. And then the materials will start shipping out in the beginning to middle part of May from our warehouse. They do ship from Minnesota. So farther you're away from Minnesota, a little bit longer on the shipping time it will take. Now for the ancillary items, the test booklets and the answer sheets are pretty much ready to go, but the test directions and the scoring guides that are dependent on getting the other pieces ready because they need to know page numbers for test directions and things like that. So those are all getting done right now in the manufacturing process. From a perspective of the online availability, if you're using TABE online today and your state allows you to move to 13 and 14, you can move over. We have a form through our support team that will transfer your licenses over, however many you need. If you're a state that has an annual agreement, then when the state allows us, we'll turn it on access. So I know some states have already started. Other states are going to start in April to start registering for the next program year. So different changes that will be happening throughout the spring here as we go forward. Looking at specifically for 13 and 14, and the modes themselves, everything will be available as it is today. So computer-based testing on and offline. So if you're in a correctional program or in an area that has limited bandwidth, there is an offline computer-based testing option. Remote testing, whatever policies you're following today in your state will continue. There's no changes on our side for remote testing. So you'll still, most people do that with a webinar on your own end and your own staff doing that. So that will continue. The big part about remote testing, and how many people do remote testing? Okay, you're used to using a URL address to go to the test. That changes. It's published already in the portal. So under the documents section, it's listed there. But if you do need it, our support team also has it. So just know that's typically the big challenge of people are using that 11 and 12 URL to do remote testing. It changes for 13 and 14. And there's a separate one for Class-E. So it's a separate URL for each administration going forward. It's in the portal now. Yep. Otherwise, you can certainly ask me. I can send it to you too. I have them saved. So looking at 13, 14 first, kind of specifically, and what's changing, what's updating. The big thing is that there aren't really big changes happening. The college and career readiness standards haven't changed. The NRS descriptors haven't changed from the Department of Education. So if you went through the process of going from 910 to 1112, that was a big change in standards. This change is more about our approval at the federal level was expiring, and we had two options: reapply with new research on the existing test, or apply for a new test with new research. So the test items themselves get overexposed, and so there's always that's why we have a new test to get new questions. So the big thing for 13 and 14 is all new questions as we go into that. Some minor changes in the objectives, and we'll go through those as we go in a few more slides. But the paper testing goes back to one answer sheet. So if you're used to paper testing, you have 8 answer sheets now, one for every level. The big change there is the reason why there's an individual answer sheet is that on level E of TABE, there's 3 2-point questions in reading. In level A, there's 15 of them. Just the real estate on the page to make room for those bubbles dictated that there's separate answer sheets. So to solve that, you go back to standardization of those 2-point questions. So instead of 3 and 15, there's 5. And where those 5 are, they're always going to be in the same spot so that the answer sheet can get laid out that way. So standardization. Also, paper versions won't have the field test items that they do today. So they'll have a few less questions than the online version has for that. The online one gets a few less field tests as well, but they still have them. Also, for testing times, it's always a big topic about testing times. The time for the test is dictated by the research that we can provide the Department of Ed. That this time that we're setting is allowing 90% of the students to finish within that allotted time. So if you remember in table 11 and 12, we reduced the time early. Probably why I don't like to use these, and they keep cutting out on me. So we plan on reducing the time for 13 and 14. Math and language is already about 5 or 10 minutes less than what it was in 11 and 12, but reading is staying the same right now for the initial. So 50 minutes per section for reading. I can tell you that the early programs that have been using 13 and 14, it's generally the average time for students taking the reading test is around 30 minutes per section. So that is about 60 minutes total instead of the 100 minutes that's allowed. It's the 90th percentile of that. That's what we have to calculate for the Department of Ed and just show the research. So if you're using paper and pencil, you'll probably have a supplement to the test directions. If you're using online, it will just get updated in the system on the timer that's built in. The change in time is based on the types of questions that our test development team is using. So I'll have an example coming up here of a sample of a reading question. Generally, the reduction in time is done by reducing the reading load for the student, not by taking questions away. We took questions away, that would mean we cover less objectives. If we cover less objectives, then we have jeopardizing the federal approval process for that. So it's just less reading or less time reading on those questions. So we'll see that as we go forward in some of the samples. Any questions so far there? Yep. Yeah, so the reduction in time is for the locator and for the, it's a general philosophy of less of a, so every the theory of less of a reading load, there isn't a specific guideline that every question had to be certain lengths. So, there might still be a longer reading passage, but there's not as many long reading passages as you go in this. So that's kind of where the reduction in the reading load is the very scientific term I've been told to use. There are new blueprints for section of the TABE test. So these are already posted on tabetest.com under that website. So each of the new blueprints are there. They are still laid out the same, just a little bit of the changes in the percentages, and we'll look at that a little bit more detailed as we go forward. So looking a little bit detailed into reading, a couple of things you'll see on reading, and I'll direct you to the bottom with the circles, that there are minor changes in the percentage weight. A little bit of that has to do with how the test was performing in the past. So if a skill, not a question, but a skill was getting consistently answered incorrectly on level E, maybe that was too hard of a skill and it would get moved to level M. So we see a percentage change between the darker shaded columns are 11 and 12, the lighter shaded columns are 13 and 14. So today, integration of knowledge and ideas is 15%. It goes down to 13, or 13.6. That 1.5 or so goes over to level M. You kind of see it level out. There's also a leveling of the percentages. That's more so to support multi-level instructional classrooms. So if we're covering the same topics across multiple levels, easier to do multiple level instruction in one room for that. So reading, that vocabulary acquisition and use comes into the reading test. That was on over to the reading test. That's, again, more so to support the way more programs are instructing that kind of reading language arts topic. So again, not a new area, but a transitioning area from language into reading area. Just a quick example of what less of a load could look like. On the left-hand side is a sample today from the reading test. It's about whale watching, what that could look like, not what it is going to look like. It's just a sample of, going from 7 to 8 paragraphs to 3 paragraphs. So less reading on the test. This also carries over to math and language, but you might see less length in the question itself. Here it's a passage. There are still passages in language, fewer passages in math, but those questions would get less in the length of that. Any questions on reading as we go into that? Correct. It's across the all test items on TABE. Yes. How does less of a reading load correlate to what we're covering and how it correlates to the high school equivalent? That might be something that still needs to be looked at. And again, when we think about TABE versus high school equivalency and what we cover versus what those tests cover, we have to cover the NRS descriptors, which are evolved from the college and career readiness standards. The high school equivalency tests follow the college and career readiness standards, their discretion. So there's not a requirement of what HiSET covers and what the GED covers. It's what they decide to cover as part of the research. So there's not a federal guideline for that, where the NRS descriptors are what we have to follow. So there's always going to be a little bit of a difference from that, because what we have to cover in each of the NRS levels is what we have to cover from level E of TABE all the way up to level A. In theory, the high school equivalency tests are not measuring the lower skills. They're measuring the higher skills for that. So looking at math a little bit more in depth here, on the left-hand side is 11 and 12. On the right-hand side is 13 and 14. What you'll see is a little bit more of a generalization of the domain titles. And we're going to mention the titles here several times. So number and operation fractions, number and operation of base 10 become now number and operation. Not that they're changing what's inside of them, but they're getting retitled under a larger title heading for that. The other area that you'll notice as we click through the next couple of slides for math is that right-hand side will start to say the same. The left-hand side will change. So if we pay attention to number and operation of fractions, we don't see that on the right-hand side anymore. We'll also start to have other domains, and we'll talk about that as we go forward. So as I'm going to switch here, now we're looking at level D. The left-hand side today on 11 and 12 is different than the level E left-hand side. If I can just go back real quick, we had geometry, measurement, and data, number and operation. Here we have functions, expressions, geometry, statistics. So different domain titles. Those domain titles have now been standardized to the same that we saw on the previous screen on the right-hand side. So again, not that the content is changing, but how it's categorized has changed. So the big question is, well, are you no longer covering ratio, no longer covering the number system? And the answer to that is no, we are, but now where are they categorized? If I look a little deeper, it's still covered on level D, but it's now covered under the title of number and operation. So again, not big changes in what the test is measuring, but changing the kind of the categories that it's listed under. And again, more so to support that kind of combined classroom effect. So we're going to cover the number system. We're going to do it at level D, which happens to be this content, versus level E that might be in this content for the curriculum side of things. The other change for math is new calculators that are used in the online test. Again, you're free to use whatever calculator you need to for the paper test, whether it is still a 4-function calculator for level M, it's still a scientific calculator for level D. It is, the one change for level A is it's all calculator allowed now, so you don't have just part 1 or part 2. But on the computer-based test, today it's a generically developed DRC developed calculator that's in the system. Moving forward, we're going to switch to the Desmos system of calculators. Is anybody familiar with Desmos? So Desmos is used in a lot of other assessments, a lot of K-12 state assessments. That's the majority of what DRC does. And so we were the only assessment within DRC not using Desmos. So guess what we got pushed to do? So now we're using the Desmos system so that we're kind of supporting that through the whole organization. What does that mean for programs? Not a lot. There's still a 4-function calculator for level M. There's still a scientific calculator for level D and A. The difference is if you're a teacher, you can go to desmos.com now and find a lot of educator resources on exercises and examples. So if you go to desmos.com and scroll right down on their main page, there's an educator section on the main page that you can go into and have practice items. Again, if you're familiar with Desmos, you know you could customize these calculators. I used Georgia as the example. Georgia is one of the state assessments that DRC has. Georgia can, if they want, put the logo on the calculator. So it's the Georgia State, education logo, or they could change the function keys if they want to. Desmos supports that. We're not doing any of that for TABE. It's just the standard 4-function calculator and the standard scientific calculator for that. Any questions so far in math? All right, we'll jump into the language. How many people use the language test? So a good portion. Every once in a while, you see a lot of people are just reading in math versus language. So again, new blueprints are available on the website. Not a lot of big changes on the language test. We do see more of a equalization of the percentages, again, to support the multi-level instructions. While we do see that vocabulary language use go away because it moved over to the reading, so that's why it's listed as NA there. But again, not too big of changes in those areas for language. We'll come back and look at a little bit more of the TABE changes and kind of examples a little bit later, but we'll just talk a little about TABE Class-E and the changes for TABE Class-E for that purpose. So TABE Class-E also, now the difference here is that we do have new standards. We have the ELP standards, we have new NRS descriptors. The good thing for TABE is that not a lot has changed. We were very well aligned to those with our existing objectives. So this is more of a refresh of the test, similar to what TABE 11 and 12 to 13 and 14 is doing, versus a big change that that we may have done from 9, 10 to 11 and 12 when there was new standards. A couple of things that are a little bit different. Not every question is new for TABE Class-E. Majority of the questions are reworked for new scenarios, and we'll see an example of that. Also, the paper test now becomes scannable into our portal. So just like TABE 11 and 12, you scan directly into our portal. There's no cost to scan. So if you are hand scoring, whether it's a TABE test or a Class-E test, I strongly encourage you to look at scanning. You can scan answer sheets for a $200 scanner at an store on Amazon. So there's no cost on our. And there we go. So just again, for paper and pencil, those materials will start being orderable later this month and then shipping in early May for those programs that are using C&D. If we're also working on to try to change how we interact with our publishing partners. So on the TABE side, we can send our data to Aztec or Essential Education. We want to do that with some of the ESL publishers, whether it's English Discoveries or Burlington or Engine. So if you're using those technology-based curriculums, we want to start connecting with those, and we've had those discussions already with Burlington, and I know that they're looking at different ways to work on their system. There are new scale scores for Class-E. So the scale scores for TABE 11 and 12 to 13, 14 don't change. The scale scores do change for Class-E. The big reason between that is that TABE 11 and 12 was developed by DRC. So those scientists have their way of doing scale scores, but TABE Class-E, A and B, was developed when we were part of McGraw-Hill, and now we're part of DRC. So different research scientists, different ways of thinking with brains that I don't have. So just new scale scores, again, the scale scores are always going to be proprietary to the publisher. That's why the GD their scores, and we have our scores for that purpose. If you are using TABE online today and you want to try out Class-E online, we can certainly set that up. So it's exact same system. So if you're interested in looking at Class-E for your ESL programs, we can certainly set up pilots for that with very little effort. Couple of changes in Class E that do change kind of the foundation, and this is where our comparison to the new ELP standards drove a little bit of the change. The left-hand side is Class E as it is today in Forms A and B. The right-hand side is the objectives for C and D, and this is reading the first page of it. In today's version of Class E, we cover quantitative literacy at a high domain level, at a category level. Quantitative literacy is numeracy, working with when numbers to do the math. So can you go to the store and buy 8 apples? What number did you hear? That's a numeracy question, not a math question. On the new ELP standards, that domain of quantitative literacy, or technically they call it numeracy now, is covered at less of an extent. So it doesn't go away, it just becomes a subdomain under an existing reading domain. Same thing for listening, and same for writing, and same for speaking. I don't have all those objective pages that are on the website, but it's a few less questions when you're working with numbers on the test. So again, not a big change, just a few less of those types of questions as it relates to numeracy terms. There are now blueprints for every section of TABE Class-E, so reading, writing, speaking, and listening. Anybody do all 4 sections of Class-E? A couple of people. For writing and speaking, they do involve constructed response questions. So writing in a online world is typing. Time added to the writing test for typing low skills. So you have that. And then for speaking, they speak into the computer and it's captured. It's not scored with AI. It can either be scored with local educator staff doing the scoring with a rubric, or DRC can do the scoring for an additional fee for that. So that's separate than the testing fee. I didn't get this slide updated, but on our website, under the online tools training, there are samples for TABE Class-E, C, and D. There are samples for 13 and 14 under the online tools training. So if you're familiar with that in the past, under the resource tab on the website, there's a section called online tools training. That's the tutorial. Many programs use that as part of their intake to show students what the test will be like. It's the exact same system, just without the timer. They also get to see they hear the reason of the answer. So you get to hear a little bit of sound in those areas. Just an example of that, and here's a sample reading question from Class E. And this is a level 2 one, which says, what does the picture show? And at the very bottom in the tutorial, they get to hear the answer. You don't obviously get to hear that, but we also don't have a timer in the right-hand corner. But this is the exact same window that you use for TABE 13 and 14. So the same exact interface once students are used to that. Just a quick sample of the writing test. Half of it is multiple choice. The other half is the constructed response, so that they're typing in a response just like you do with the paper and pencil version of the test. And then this is an example of where there has a scenario change. If you've ever gone through Class E and seen a sample, there used to be a question about a check for $5 on the test. How many people wrote a check this week? So how many of your students have written a check in the last year? So that was not a good scenario, but that was a numeracy question, identifying the amount of a check, about telling time on recognizing the numbers on the clock. So updating those scenarios, but still measuring the same numeracy standard for that process. Any questions related to Class E specific? Yep. Yeah, so for answer sheets, both for TABE and for Class E, the answer sheets will be Scories or the scannable answer sheets for that. There will not be answer keys available like they were in the past to hand score your own answer sheet. So if you are hand scoring, it would be with the Scories, because those are self-scoring. You rip them open and they're marked on the answer key inside. What state are you in? And I'm gonna guess something to Schur's, right? And for this data system. Data system's been updated with all the scores. Yes. I have versions of them. They're not pretty. They're data. The pretty version is technically called the scoring guide for both. Technically, that's a part of the paper and pencil product. It's not a part of the online product, so they'll be available in late April, May timeframe as a manual type of, yes. But they're in the process of going from a spreadsheet into a manual. Yep. Yep. Question? Not yet. There's still just a two-part locator. The So reading and writing is part one, listening and speaking is part two. I think this also leads to the question of in Class E online, if I only want to do reading, I take the reading slash writing locator that in theory could place me into writing, but I don't want to do writing and I don't want to show writing to the students. So I don't know if that was where your question was going. But there's a dual purpose locator that part one will place you into reading and or writing. So it's not that I only have to take part of the locator. I'm taking the full locator of part one. But I think a lot of people ask the question of in the online system, you're used to being able to, let's say, turn off or on reading, math, or language. In Class E, reading and writing are always going to be listed. And that's what we're working on is to be able to deselect writing even when we're doing the locator that's technically a reading writing locator. Yeah, I'm not sure how those scoring is. I don't think it's average like that, so I'll double check that and kind of figure out where you're from. Oh, yeah. So yeah, so I'll definitely find out. Let Caleb know, what's going on, and we can dig a little deeper into that. Yeah, you have a question on similar to that? Yeah, so I think that kind of question of locating the correctly way or in that process, and I will say both and for class locator test itself had separate subject matter expert workshops to set the cut scores and to evaluate the cut scores. So in theory, the locators should be more accurate. In the past, locators were piece in the puzzle of placing a student. So ideally, if you would have read the directions, you would have an intake interview, you would have their educational history, and you would have their locator scores, and then you can assign them to a TABE level, TABE or TABE Class E level. Most often now, you just have a person walking in saying they want to register you for your program, so you put them in the locator, and that's all the information you have. So we wanted to make sure that those cut points for each level. Now, how are they being prepared for a locator, and are you going through maybe using the tutorial, using the sample questions, or are they seeing the test question number one for the first time ever and getting a little test anxiety and not doing well on an intake test, but then going through class and becoming more familiar and doing well on the post test and being so a lot of different factors, I think, but we certainly look into that more if it's happening a lot at, again, if are you in Oklahoma too, are we all sitting together? Oh, okay, well, I can double check, and work with Jeremy. I'll dig in a little deeper into that question. There is a 1314 locator. Yep, separate for that. Yeah. Question. Oh boy. Thank you. Because I can't see it right here. So now you've been hired. Yes, 1314 has its own brand new locator. Same thing with C and D as well. On line one in class C and D, I will dig a little deeper in that. So I'll save that question from the chat and try to get back to. I'm trying my best to kind of formulate the question in my response into that. So I will keep doing better on that. Yeah, so I think that's what what text is most, or what curriculum is most aligned to Class-E. You know, again, we don't have an authorized curriculum process for either for Class-E or for TABE. So if people use the name, I mean, a lot of books and a lot of materials have TABE in their name. Some books, I think the big difference is that on the ESL side, most curriculum is about an objective area, not about an assessment. Um, and even when we look at, I'll just use Burlington because that's the one I looked at once. You know, in Burlington, you can go in today and you can assign lessons for each of the, if I go backwards in our slides here, each of these left-hand side domains of quantitative literacy or read words, but you're not assigning lessons for individual skills. That's partly Burlington's philosophy of holistically teaching the domain areas. So other publishers, and certainly more on that side, they teach to the skills. And so that's a little different philosophy, but I think now that we have the ELP standards, we'll see a little bit more between the assessments and the curriculum because every specific standards. TABE Class-E A and B was designed, we took 12 different states and their ESL standards and combined to our Class-E on the left-hand side. So we're very lucky that that turned into very similar to what the ELP standards are measuring. But, you know, from a curriculum standpoint, it was up to them to decide what they were covering in those areas. But thank you for helping with those. So the next quick area to talk about just real quick is our workforce area and kind of where TABE is used. Up in the top left corner, we have the WIOA programs, which most programs are part of Title I, some are part of Title II. I'm sorry, most are part of Title II, some are part of Title I. The left-hand side, if you're in correction, again, sometimes that is under WIOA, sometimes it's separately funded through the state. But there are programs that use TABE for other uses. In the bottom of the screen, the college placement, there are a lot of university and community college systems that approved placement tools, not acceptance, placement. So if you're going into for enrollment, you get placed into the for-credit track or the not-for-credit track if you need some remedial help. So there are many colleges that use that. There are states that are using TABE now as the high school equivalency. So is anybody here from Tennessee? Tennessee? So Tennessee that uses TABE. Illinois program I think they're working on. Oklahoma I know is working on initiatives, all state initiatives that what they accept for high school equivalency. So whether you can substitute a TABE test for a section of the high school equivalency, those are all state-driven initiatives. But the bigger area is that top right corner, whether we are talking about IETs or CTE programs, or even just general working with our local workforce community in our areas. So there are a lot of adult ed programs that also work with the workforce boards or just with local employers. In Nebraska, for example, the state police require TABE to be hired into the police academy. So they deliver the TABE test. Now, I happen to know that because they are a customer of DRC. But in Kentucky, the Jim Beam Distillery requires a TABE test for about 18 different jobs in the distillery. They don't purchase from DRC. They work with the local adult ed programs in those counties in Kentucky for that. Same thing with a lot of nursing programs or licensed nursing programs that hospitals work directly with adult ed programs or the workforce board. So there's a lot of those relationships that are happening. And so we want to continue to support that kind of IET and CTE model with our workforce portal. And there are programs that use the workforce portal today, but it is still fairly new. So I just wanted to quickly review that. And going through the workforce portal, it is a project that we worked on with Metametrics, who is a research company from North Carolina that does Lexiles and Quantiles, and also with the U.S. Department of Labor's Job Corps centers. So Job Corps centers use TABE across all their centers. They also design their curriculum around Lexiles and Quantiles to have reading and math measures for both their instructional side and their assessment side. So they wanted to connect all those pieces. And so we did a study back in the fall of 22 into 23. If you're using TABE Online at that time, we took out the unscored questions and put in the Lexile and Quantile questions. So now we know what Lexile level goes to what TABE score and what Quantile goes to what math score. And we can do that kind of work for that. What that allowed us to do is to look at what Metametrics has done, and they've gone through the ONET database and looked at the reading and math requirements for over 950 jobs now on the ONET database. And I'm not going to go into the live demo, just our time is short, but I have a couple of slides of what our workforce portal is. Up at the top of the screen in the middle, you can see architecture and construction. That's one of the 16 career clusters from the Department of Labor. In the box on the right, I think it's heating and air conditioning. That's one of the careers under architecture and construction. So I'm sitting down, and the workforce portal is built into our portal. It is an add-on piece. It's, I think, $5.25 for a year for it per student you have. But the student scores show up in purple. The job scores show up in gray. So this student is far away from the reading requirement or the kind of the score range for this heating and air conditioning job. I think it works out that there's actually 2 NRS levels that you could gain on that if you kept that student enrolled in your program. Also, we want to pay attention to that score of that career area. So 576 for the reading requirement, 576 for heating and air conditioning. It might change for other career areas. But it's also, how does it relate to high school equivalency? You know, this is a high school equivalency job. If I go to the next screen, it tells me the salary and the kind of the growth expectations of this job across the country in the different state areas. But what's the requirement of, you know, on a high school equivalency? Well, it's listed in the ONET database as a high school graduate or a GED recipient for that career. So we're going to look at that a little bit closer as we go forward. I can go into the system and search by a career. So I was sitting down with a student and he said he wanted to go into heating and air conditioning because his uncle owned the company. And so I can say, well, your reading and math scores need to improve a little bit to be successful. What Metametrics and the Job Corps we're measuring is what does it take to be successful in year 1 of the career? So I don't, in this phlebotomist job, I don't need to be a 573 to get into the career. So if I'm working on an IET or a CTE program, maybe I want to get close to that because the curriculum is going to be at a higher level. But these are just targets to be successful in year 1 of that career area. And just real quick with another career is the solar tech installer. So the workforce portal allows you to connect jobs to their TABE scores. And I've used the same students, so the TABE scores haven't changed, but the job scores have changed a little bit on that. Just real quick, and we'll come back to some of the research behind that, you know, how it connects in, but I wanted to point out where you can go for information for TABE and for TABE Class-E. 2 sources. One is in our portal, and one is on our public website. In the portal are all the manuals that you might need, the test directions, the scoring guides, things like that, that you would log in and get a manual from with a username and password. The website has all the instructional areas, the blueprints, the sample questions, the research, all that information is on the website. The tutorial, so if I want to use the tutorial. And the majority of the research is under the resource tab. So there are other marketing areas of the website that will have just general product information. But generally, the good stuff is going to be under the resource tab, whether it's there's a 1314, there's a C&D section, or there's just general resource that is applicable to everything. So you always want to check that site. Also on tabetest.com is where the order forms are that they'll get posted later this month for that process. Another area is kind of understanding what test we should be delivering the next time so that we have the best chance of showing improvement for that student. So we have created this next test assignment chart. This chart is also built in, the chart's on the website under, anybody want to guess where it's under on the website? Under the resources. So that's there, but it's also built into the new individual diagnostic profile for TABE. So we'll see it up here when I show you a quick sample of the report. But I'm just going to look over here on the top left for reading. I have a student that came in, took the locator, and they get a 450 on their locator, or the 450 on their pretest. Their next test should be a level E. But if another student came in and got a 525 on their pretest, their next test has to be a level M in order to show growth. So there's a lot of programs that just constantly retest a student on the alternate form, and that's not always the best practice because you may not have room to grow on the scale for that. So I will admit we stole this from a program. We made it prettier. And we also made one that matches for TABE Class-E. So there's a TABE Class-E chart as well. That's also on the resource tab. It does look prettier in person than it does on the slide here. The colors are getting washed out for that. So again, just these are guidelines. And again, many people have these on scratch pieces of notes taped to their wall to kind of guide them. It's just verifying all the numbers are the same and correct for everything. And that falls in then to all the reports. So whether it's TABE or TABE Class-E, the reports are available the same way. A couple of things that are updated on the reports is for the locator. The locator, if you're using the auto locator in TABE Online or Class-E Online, populated in the locator report. If you're frustrated with that, you knew that they weren't in there before with TABE 11 and 12. The thought is if you're doing the automatic locator, you don't need to know the results because it's moving the student right into the test, but many people wanted to look at it, or some states require it gets recorded, so they have that. So if you're running the locator reports, the auto locator scores will show in there as well. Most people use that individual profile report, and we'll look a sample of that as just a couple little tweaks that are happening on that. But just know there are also individual portfolios and the ability to pull all your data out in an Excel format. One of the big changes for TABE from a computer-based testing and Class-E is that we are now switching, using the exact same system, but in a separate administration is what we call it. It's just a separate section of the portal. So if you've noticed in the top left-hand corner when you're in the TABE online system, there now is a drop-down menu that says 1314, C&D, or just TABE. The one that says just TABE is all your historical information. So anything to do with 910, 11, 12, A and B for Class-E. Now going forward, you'll go into a brand new section of the portal, same functions that you have used, but you're in a database for that. So anybody that has old test sessions, old students that were spelled wrong and that you're not using anymore, and you have notes in front of them that said do not use, all that stays in the TABE administration. Your 13-14 administration will be brand new, and all your staff people will be there, but your students will not. Test sessions won't be there. So you're adding new students and new test sessions, both for TABE 13-14 and for Class-E. There is an addition in student management. Many of you have used the bulk upload. There's a spreadsheet that you can add students with a spreadsheet in student management. Now, if you put the test session name in there, it will populate the test session. It'll create a test session and automatically register the person for that test session. So many larger programs or programs that do more, let's say, advanced registration. So if you're doing walk-ins where person walking in and you register them and you put them in a test, you're still probably going to do that, just entering them into a test session. But if you have a registration website, or you have a walk-in and you have a list of 100 names, you can a spreadsheet and have the test session listed with whether it's on specific test level, and it will automatically create those test sessions and add those students to those. Yes. Yep. Yeah. So for the bulk upload, there is a sample spreadsheet right in student management. It's in the system, and we can move that to our. We're going to do some dedicated webinars on that coming up in the near future, national webinars. So, but it's directly in student management. It's there today because you can always upload a spreadsheet. Now it just has the examples of how to put the test session in the session column. So again, if you're a larger program or a program that collects names and then starts your, we're going to accept names in April, but the program on May 1st, we can then upload all those names we've collected in April and have it automatically register for that. Yep. So it was, the system was designed for only new students, but our support team has already tested it, and it works for existing students as well. So if you want to, pre-test everybody with an auto, and then change the spreadsheet, and half of the spreadsheet says 13M, the other half says 14, and some people are different for them too. So it works both ways, and we were a little surprised. That session is already created and you're matching the name, it will add them to that session. Yeah, but it is floating into a new test session for that purpose. Question that I'm going to try to repeat. Yeah, so that's what it's used for any testing. It was designed initially for intake, and what it said was new students, but our support team has tested it, and it works with post testing, and when you do go into student management, the sample is a cheat locator or to turn on 13 or 14. So one column is your test session name, one column is the test it is, whether it's 13, 14, or whether it's auto locator or not, and they have little codes for that. You just follow the key for that. So just looking at quickly into the inside system, and I don't have it highlighted, but I mentioned that 13 and 14 in the left-hand side under the administration. So that's what changes. All the other functions in the online system are the same. Before you weren't picking what section you were going into. Now you select the section. But to run the reports, I can still see I'm in my sample program, and I can go into the locator profile or the individual profile. It's only going to run 13, 14 reports. So if you need to run a historical report, you need to change that drop-down menu up in the top left from under the administration to be back to TABE, and you can still run your old reports for that. Just real quick, and I don't know where we're at on time. We're doing okay. The locator report at the very bottom is the details. So the students' information is at the very bottom of how they did. The top is the cut scores for that. So we'll certainly look at those cut scores back on that question that came up both for TABE and for TABE Class-E. For the individual profile, again, most of the information is the same. Very top right corner, there's that next recommended test level. So we're putting that in there. I will not have you squint and try to look at that too closely because it's a bad example because this person was taking a level A test and I should have made it a level M test to a D or something like that. So, but just know that it's there. And I will, and the right to the left of that, you'll notice there's an asterisk in the NRS column for NRS level 6 for this purpose. Again, another bad example, but the asterisk has been added in the NRS column in place of the plus and minus signs that TABE used to use. So the plus and minus signs were all kind of misused or misunderstood. They were really just indicators if you had a low score or a high score. Some states thought they were in not accurate scores. They had to retest, and that wasn't the case. They were still valid scores. So we took away the plus and minus signs and now added the asterisk. If you see an asterisk, it means that they've reached the highest NRS level of that form. And so they need to move up next level of TABE. And again, putting an asterisk on a 6 was a bad example, but if let's say it was a 1, they should go up to a 2, which could still be done on level E. So you might see it when it's the highest of that form. The next recommended test we won't see when we get into the Class-E reports. We thought of it after Class-E reports were done, so it's going back and getting added, but it's not there right now, where it is there right now for 13 and 14. Question? No, if there's an asterisk, it's not an indicator that you have to retest on a pretest. It's just an indicator that there's a way to get a higher score on their next test unless you move to a higher level of the test for that purpose. And that will be both TABE and TABE Class-E. Yes. Both 13 and 14 and now Class-E will both have out of range scores. Class-E was under an again old scientist from the McGraw-Hill days versus DRC, and so Class-E now follows the same as what TABE 11 and 12 is, that you need a minimum qualifying score to get a scale score. So yes, there are out of ranges. So if you take a higher level Class-E or a higher level TABE test and do poorly, you don't get a scale score. On the other side, if you take a lower level Class-E or a lower level TABE test and get every question right, you hit a ceiling score. So it does cap out at that range, and then you'll get the asterisk for that. Question over there. No, so there are no pluses anymore on Class-E or on TABE. No, so LACES should have the new programming that it requires if it's an NA because they did poorly, or here's the highest score, and I don't have the chart here, but the highest score for, well, I can kind of go back. Let me see this one. So, if we think about 535, this one, sorry, 427 on reading NRS in the top left corner. If I score a 427, I would have an asterisk on that score because I have to move to a level 2 test. That's a state policy. So how you treat we recommend to states. So if I have and I'm using this example, if I pre-test and my pre-test is a 427 on reading, I have an asterisk next to my NRS level, which is a 3, so I'd have a 3 asterisk next to it. My next test should be the moving up to a level 2 test. How the state interprets that, and that's what we've told the state. So the state policy should now, for going forward with C&D, would allow that to move up. So we don't have to throw out the pretest. We just have to move up, because you're already going to move that person to the higher class, because they're going to have, in, let's say it's a level 1 class versus a level 2 class. They're going to be in the level 2 class learning level 2 skills. They would then take the level 2 test for that. So we're not throwing out a score just because it has an asterisk on a pretest. And LACES should have all that programmed in. We've given all that information to LACES already. And she's in a non-LACES state, so they have their own data system that is a little bit different. Yep. Yeah, and it just, I mean, if I score a 427 on level 1 of Class E, I have no way of making a gain unless I take a level 2 test. That's kind of what we're pointing on this, so if it's my pre-test and I get a 427, yes, I'll have an asterisk on the NRS level. My NRS level is 3, but there's no way to take a level 1 Class E test and get a higher score or show any improvement. So if I see an asterisk, I know that that person's going into a higher class, and they're going to take a more rigorous assessment, because they're going to move into the level 2 class, or whatever, the intermediate class maybe that you're calling it at your program. They're not in your beginning or your introduction class or your level 1 class, whatever title you give it, because they're at the top of that range. Yep. So the out score, I thought we have, maybe we don't have one on here. It just gives the NA for their scale score, range for the S level. So just as it is for TABE, that now the same method Class E will carry over to that. Not a big change on the second page of the individual profile report. One thing that you'll notice if you look closely at that, you'll start to see the standard number now going next to the skill area. So we're putting the standard number next to the skill for those that align their skills directly to the curriculum. That might be a little bit helpful for that. So just a little bit more information on the second that. Portfolio, just to show you, again, a portfolio is all the tests a student has taken in your program versus a profile, which is the details of one test. So this person tested 6 times and they have 6 different scores, but they don't have the detail. They just have the high level scores on the portfolio. Same thing for Class E, that still has the locator report. So the locator, also the individual profile report. Another question or no? Okay. And then the second page for the Class E has those skills for that. There are new, if you're familiar with, on the website, there's a crosswalk of our definition of a skill to what that full definition is from the standard. So that's being updated for 13, 14, and we're going to work on one for C&D as well for that purpose. And then the portfolio for C&D, you'll see this separated out between what form C&D that they took and the dates that they took that. Couple of other things. The one report that you can do is the on-demand extract, and that allows you to pull your data out in an Excel format. So if you don't want the PDF format, you want just an Excel to import into your own learning system, you can do that through the report menu. Couple of things about the on-demand report. Does anybody know why that's helpful? People that complain about testing or report times. Yeah, so scoring a test is very easy for us. Making it into a pretty PDF takes a few minutes. So again, if you need a score immediately, you can always go to the on-demand extract, click on the Today button, and it'll run all your tests for today, and that score will be available immediately as soon as the student is done. Question? Yeah, because it'll pull. It's thinking of test date, not scan date. Yeah, but that's interesting. Um, the other thing about report times, some people have some that they're a little bit slow every once in a while. The reports today, going back to what we talked about of administrations or drop down menu of are we in the TABE or in the 13 to 14 or the C&D? In the TABE administration that everybody works in today, that has everything on our side. It has 910, it has 11, 12, it has A and B, and each of those run in a process. So if you had a student that finished an 11 and 12 test, right as the process that we do internally was finishing for 11 and 12, it has to go through, it has to wait for us to circulate and do the query on the A and B, and then come back and do the query on 9, 10, even though there's nothing there, and then come back and do the new query on 11 and 12. So that's why we say 15 minutes or so for reports. If you had to wait longer than 15 minutes, that will be greatly reduced with C&D or 13, 14 because it's only that section of the portal that you're going through. So reports will be quicker automatically. But how many people run reports? When you go into the report menu and you find the student's name on the far right, there's a PDF icon. If you sit there and tap that thing like Pac-Man, it's not doing anything. So if it comes up blank and you can then go back and hit that PDF again and it's blank, and you come back and hit that PDF again and it's blank, it's never rerunning the query. You have to go right above that and click on the blue bar that says submit the query again, and then we'll rerun it. So a lot of people that have waited forever are constantly hitting that button trying to get it to refresh, and that's not a refresh button. So that will continue with C&D and 13 and 14. You always go up to the main search bar and just research for that query, and it will rerun that. So reports should not take longer. The average is 5 to 7 minutes. They shouldn't take any longer than 15 for that. But if you need them quicker, you can always go to the on-demand. Yes. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, they are scoring and reporting section. So if they're doing reading and math first, the language is the last one to calculate. I will tell you that also, not that I have a solution for it, but during the spring and the fall, you are familiar with your state's K-12 system. When they do the state testing, that all is on our same platform, even though we're separate administrations. So whether, if you've ever heard of WIDA, WIDA is the ESL consortium that I think 30 states are part of. They do all their testing at the same time. When they're running reports, it slows down the system a little bit. So we try to keep that separate. But, the good thing about TABE is you guys have afternoon programs and evening programs, and generally the K-12 is in the morning. So if you, it might be a little bit slower for that, but we're continuing to work on that. Now, the other area to kind of look at is the high school equivalency and some of the research areas. And so we have the existing research on the website under resources for the high school equivalency that shows that TABE scores are, 536 for reading gets you the minimum passing score on the high school equivalency. So if we're thinking about the GED, 45 or the 8 on the high set, if we go back to that, a 536, and somebody gets a 536 and they move on to high school equivalency and pass, it's a great accomplishment. They passed the requirement for the high school equivalency. 536, how does that compare back to our heating and air conditioning job? It's below. That job was a 576. So not a big discrepancy, but they're not for that career just by having the minimum requirement for a high school equivalency. So part of the reason that GED and HiSET both have those second level cut scores. Also, GED has that third level cut score up to the college ready or plus credit score. So again, if we can retain students a little bit more by maybe mixing in the workforce portal to say, here's the job you want, here's the TABE score we're going to try to get you close to. This is a little bit above the high school equivalency. So we're not trying to immediately get out of adult ed and take us at a minimum level. Yes, there are going to be for their high school equivalency, but some need the actual education for that job career area. So we want to make sure that you have the skills, whether you're going into post-secondary or you're going into a, we have programs in Pennsylvania now that are using TABE in the high schools because they have open enrollment for CTE programs. And a lot of people want to be in that because it's cool to work with a welding torch. but not everybody has the math skills to be in that. So they're giving TABE to high school sophomores as an entrance requirement into the CTE program because they want to have them certain levels for that. So we're doing that in Pennsylvania and Washington. There's a question. So for accommodations, there haven't been any changes in the process of that. So whatever your state requires is the policy. We support the use of the accommodation. So in the online system, you'll still be able to extend the time or to put the text to speech turned on or turn the timer off. So no changes in that process. I do know, and I'm not up on it as completely. I know that category 1, 2, and 3 is the old way of thinking about accommodations. And so there are new guidelines on our website that kind of, I still like the old way because you can kind of think of that category 1 and 2 don't really change the test. But if you add a reader to a reading test, you're changing the test. Or if you're allowing all the math tests, you're changing the test. So those category 3, you kind of knew. From our standpoint, we support the use of the accommodation. It doesn't have to go through us like a high school equivalency process. To do it is still under student management, so it still stays the same for that. Yes. No, because that student didn't carry over. That student you have to add as a new student into the 13 and 14 administration. So any accommodations that were previously assigned to whether it was A and B of Class E or 11 and 12 stay in the 11 and 12 administration side student into the new administration. So you'll reassign those accommodations and correct the spelling of their name for that. So again, just 536 for reading, 537 for math. So then we have these two comparisons to say, yes, your TABE score, we want to get close to high school equivalency, but we also want to get close to the workforce portal. The other side effect of that is looking at grade scores. In TABE 9 and 10, we used to have grade equivalents. We'd have a 9.2 for a math test. Anybody know what that meant? 9th grade, second month. What were you doing in the second month of freshman year in high school? Quick. Or better yet, what was that? Anybody? I went to high school in Wisconsin in the mid 80s. Anybody do that? Yeah, see, I went to Southern Wisconsin. Every district had their own standards. So what my definition of 9th grade math, I would say it's algebra 1. A lot of people would agree. Does everybody agree? No, because I had my son in freshman year took geometry. In 10th grade, I took algebra 1 because the teacher didn't like me in 9th grade. So my perception of what grade levels are, I have 2 points. I have my son and I have mine. And I have a little bit of work, perspective into that. If I never, wasn't in the K-12 district teaching recently to know what was being taught in a specific district. But now, I have my influence of what a grade range score is. So people still use them. We would prefer you to use a grade, the scale score, but the scale score, local employers don't know what that means. So Nebraska State Police, going back to them, they want the 11th grade reading level. The U.S. Army wants a 10th grade reading level to get in the warrant officers program. So, they have their own uses of TABE. They set their own scores for TABE. But we want to provide some context for that, some guidance, not some policy, just guidance. So as an offshoot of our workforce portal and our work with Metametrics, Metametrics has contracts with, I think, 30 or 33 states across the country. Absent of any word that starts with a C and ends with a core that a lot of people don't like, there isn't a really common standard to know what 9th grade math is across the country. But if Metametrics is measuring readers at the 9th grade level and the 3rd grade level and the 12th grade level, we have an idea what a normative score for reading and math is with Metametrics' research. So we kind of put that together with our TABE data, and we have a chart that's available, not fully available because it's not pretty. It's not as pretty as the other charts that we had earlier. But this is a grade range chart, not a grade equivalent chart. So we go back to that 536 we had in reading for high school equivalency. That's generally around the 8th to 9th grade level. It's not a 12th grade. If you minimally pass the GED, you're not reading at the 12th grade. If I gave an average high school freshman the GED test or the HiSET test, there's a likelihood that they would pass at the minimum level. If I gave that average student the same test 4 years later, what happened in between those 4 years? Some of those students went on and took AP classes. Some of them didn't. Some of them took a CTE class. but they're all going to probably do a little bit better based on having 4 more years of education, whether they were in that. So again, when we think about that AP world, in the college and career readiness standards and the NRS descriptors, level 6 is assuming a lot of AP content of the NRS and the higher levels of the college and career readiness standards. So now we see that 12 plus show up. So we're not really thinking about in the K-12 world anymore. It's more the K-14, maybe 14 and a half to 15 if you took a lot of AP classes. So we don't want to just simply say there's 12 grade levels and 6 NRS levels and divide them, in half and come up with 2 grades for every NRS level, because the content is more rigorous than that. But if I need to give a local employer an idea of what a TABE scale score is roughly in a grade range, this can be a guide for that. Again, if the Army wants to know what 10th grade reading is, we showed them you can get a 576 or 575 on level D or level A. We can show them the blueprints and say, here are the standards and the skills that are being covered on both. Do you want them to have all these or just some of these? And then they can decide what score they want for their program. So again, it's more of a resource to use for that process. Questions on grades? I didn't get good ones, so they're not good answers. So just to finish up, everything I talk about is our guidelines. You have to refer back to your state's assessment policy 2 program to have exactly for that process and what that might be. And I always get back to tabetest.com for the resources for more information related to that. This is being recorded, so it'll be on the app after we're done. I think I have to upload the slides to the app, so right now it's just a recording. So you have that information. If you need to reach out to me, I'm happy to share the slides quicker. If you want to send me an email, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, I'll get them loaded to the app for that purpose. But other than that, other questions, concerns? So if you are in one of the administrations, you do not move over if you do well on the test. So in your example, I'm in CD because I'm an ESL student. At some point, I test out of ESL. I'm going to become an adult ed student at your program. I would have to get added to the 13-14 side of the portal for that. Just a real quick, and I didn't cover it. There are still exit points for Class-E if you are taking the level 4, which is the highest level of Class-E, and you get halfway through the NRS level 6, exit out. So if you take a pretest and you get the exit score, it'll give you a notification that that student is not a ESL person. So if you're using all, for example, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, you can still serve that student as an ESL student by measuring them in listening or speaking or writing. You're not measuring them in reading. Doesn't mean you can't teach them reading. You're just not measuring them in reading. So that's kind of the benefit to use more than one content area, is that you can continue providing services for that. Are there questions on the chat? Okay. So I think that's kind of all content. I always refer you back to the resources, and for any new information that we'll begin to post on there. We'll still do some national webinars. If you don't get our emails, I encourage you to get added to our list on our website for that. But we'll be doing those national webinars, kind of more about that bulk upload that we talked about. And certainly if your state needs any specific attention, just let us know for that. But thank you very much. And thank you for your help on the questions. Yes, they're both under the resources, those charts. Yep.